Namaste and welcome to the Divas That Care Network. I'm your host, Gia-Raquel Rose, owner of Airs Above Yoga, and you are listening to Above the Ground podcast. If this is your first time tuning in, our network is going into its 16th year and is listened to in over 30 countries. I would like to personally thank you for giving me the gift of your time. As always, it is my honor to hold space with and for you. And so today we have made little progress on our recent move upgrade to our space. And so we are coming to you once more from the mat, which is makes a little bit more sense this week as it is our asana focus week. And I just want to talk a little bit about forward motion, with obviously a lot of things that have gone on for positive change in my life recently, and also the art and the balance, the delicate balance of acceptance. So what is really key and important to me when we think about something like acceptance, which can kind of be like a trigger word for some, because generally you're accepting of something that is not desirable to you, right? Like acceptance means, if you're accepting something that's good, I feel like people make it more of a positive connotation by calling it receiving. Whereas accepting, yeah, okay, you can accept a gift, but notice how it's rare that people use that word in that way, right? They say that you receive a gift, or they say that I received this, or this came to this blessing, I received this blessing, right? It's very rarely I accepted this blessing. And I think that that's, a language issue, right? Not a yoga issue. But I had, it was Easter for those who celebrate last week, Passover this week for those who celebrate that instead. And so, as I generally tend to do my posting on Sundays, it was also my birthday this past week. So I decided to say, you know what, I'm going to release my OCD on my format with my interview episode, and I'm just going to let that go for this particular series. So I do apologize, and I will make sure to bring our interview episode back upcoming. But I just felt that the space, the absence was needed. The taking the day on Easter Sunday, and giving myself a little bit of acceptance to let my OCD let go of the fact that the format was not going to be exactly what I want it to be for you guys. My responsibility to you and my dedication to this and to keeping things consistent for you, for me, and for all parties involved. So again, we've talked about this quite a lot. The idea of when is it okay to practice forgiveness of yourself, forgiveness of others, acceptance of not doing things just a certain way. And that's a big theme for us whether it comes to our diet, our yoga practice, our meditation practice. I've heard one rule of thumb is to never let 2 days go by if you're talking about like a daily practice, like a meditation or a workout or your yoga practice, something like that, because of the idea of the 21-day pattern. And if you start to lapse in that, man, is it a slippery slope. So that is always a big theme for us when we're talking about dedication to and support of positive reinforcement of, the goals that we choose, the things that we align with, that we want for ourselves, that we want for our lives and for our betterment, the conscious choices that take the small, deliberate daily steps and actions to make them better moving for you and for your trajectory for the long term, right? Because generally speaking, when you're talking about the little things that you do every day, those are the habits that create the positive growth. And it's oftentimes so much easier to fall into the negative patterns that are very easy and that give us immediate results, like let's tongue in cheek for 2 weeks ago, the potato chip, right? So it's very easy to fall into what's easy, a lot harder to require the discipline to have the goal, the delayed gratification in mind as you move towards it. And I think a yoga practice is a prime example of the balance of when to let it go, when to forgive, when to meet yourself where you are, and when to then again drag your resistant what back onto that mat. And so that's one of the things that I want to touch on today. So I just wanted to acknowledge the elephant of the room and the fact that we are skipping an interview episode for this particular series, this past series, but don't fear not, we will have another one upcoming, and we're going to jump right into our yoga. And so to that end, With regard to forward motion, because I think that stagnancy is, I had a metaphor that I love. Stagnancy is the end of everything, is it not? Right? The body in motion stays in motion, the body at rest stays at rest. I had a very dear love of mine, my first dog as I was an adult, the first dog that was all mine, not a family dog. And as he was nearing the end of his life, as many dogs do, he had hip issues. And he would, if he stood in one place for too long, his hind end, his legs would start, especially on like a hardwood floor or slippery surface, his hind legs would start to separate and splay out to the side. And he couldn't stand still. He could either sit, lie down, or walk. And I remember being like, this is a metaphor for life, right? This is a metaphor for life. If you don't keep moving and you stand still, your legs are going to splay out. And you're either going to be forced to lay down, sit down, or you're going to be very, very uncomfortable trying to just stay in one place. So I always remember his name was Brew. He was my baby. And I always remember that lesson that he taught me, that you need to keep moving. And that has been a definite theme for me, and certainly one that I struggle with and definitely need a kick in my butt sometimes too. So with that in mind, I know that there's thought processes in probably Eastern medicine that and just logic and reason that talk about our legs as the seat of our movement, our knees specifically when it comes to energy. If you have swelling in your joints and your knees, it kind of can signal an energetic stagnancy. So I want to focus when we talk about our asanas, this sequence, on our legs, on poses that help our legs, because whenever we talk about yoga and we talk about asana and we talk about a yoga practice, we are talking about, again, the balance, right? It's all a give and take. Any muscle that you are strengthening, the opposing muscle group is releasing in order to support that strength, and vice versa. So a lot of times I'll say in a class, I'll say, hey, listen, if you are not engaging your quads when you're in a forward fold, you're doing your body a disservice, especially if you are doing a balancing forward fold where you're actually hanging the torso over the legs and suspended and utilizing gravity to support that deepening. When you're talking about the legs in general, it is probably one of the easier, or I'll say simpler ways to kind of picture that. And I think that's a great way to get people to start to embody that, right? If you are trying to lengthen through your hamstrings, one of the best ways to support that is to engage your quadriceps. So to that end, anytime we talk about a yoga practice in general, we are talking about the balance of the body's mechanics, the balance of the body's equilibrium, in addition to obviously the energy, the mind, and all of the other aspects that come into play, because it's such a comprehensive practice. When we talk about forward motion, we're talking about energy moving through our legs, connecting with the energy of the earth, getting grounded so that we're moving from a place of grounded, centered, positive motion, right? Not frantic, frazzled. Motion can also be detrimental, impulsive, rash, right? We're coming from a place of deliberate, positive progress and ways to perpetuate that. So we've recently talked about our warriors, right? And warriors are a fabulous leg strengthening option for people. I want to focus and zone in a little bit more on the poses that build that strength. So what are we talking about? We're going to be talking about our chair pose. We're going to be talking about our goddess pose, and we're going to be talking about high lunge. And that's for the strengthening aspect. When we get into the releasing aspect, forward folds they are going to be a thing. Any kind of forward fold, when done appropriately, to target the legs and not dip into the lower back, which is where, as instructors, we see a lot of misaligned, well-intentioned forward folds that are not targeting where they're supposed to be targeting because they're not set up properly. And so that's why I always recommend a qualified professional to assist you in your practice as you're starting to learn and grow. But moving forward, and obviously in vinyasa, right? I'm a vinyasa lover. In vinyasa, it is wonderful to be able to move right? And the movement is the entire body. It's not dedicated just to the legs, although the legs are a massive support structure. It is an entire body flow. And so with that in mind, there are a lot of vinyasa practices that incorporate at least two out of, if not three, of the postures that I just referenced. So, talking about chair pose, for those of you that are very unfamiliar with yoga, chair pose is kind of literally what it sounds like, where you are lifting up through the upper abdominals, through the chest area. Hands traditionally can be reaching up over the head with fingertips interlaced. They can be interlaced behind you to open the shoulders. There are lots of arm variations for chair, but traditionally the legs are either balls of the feet and inner heels together, so feet really together, knees together, and then that internal rotation, so you're really squeezing those inner thighs together. Knees are bent, you're sitting back and reaching back with your hips, keeping your knees behind your toes and coming into a very, as we'll say, as deep a squat as you can, comfortably with your knees, your hips, your balance, and the soles of your feet in mind, right? And it's a very invigorating, strengthening sun salute part B variation, right? So sun B incorporates chair pose, and it's a quad strengthener. If you ever did wall sits, it's not dissimilar to that, only you're incorporating your balance and maybe not going quite as deep to protect the crucial knee, right? Both knees in this case. So chair pose is a wonderful way to strengthen. Now, what are you not doing when you're strengthening in chair pose? Well, there's not a lot that you are releasing necessarily in that pose, because you're really working the entirety of the leg in its from toe to hip, essentially, right? The entire leg is firing. Ideally, you are lifting up through the arches of the feet. You're engaging all of that energy, kind of drawing it up from the earth and really focusing on drawing in, rolling in, squeezing in, bringing all of that energy inwards towards you. One could argue that you are definitely lengthening through the upper body. So as we talk about the, quad hamstring relation, abdominal lat relation, when we're talking about the front and back, we can also make that same kind of alignment come into the upper body versus the lower body. So in a pose like chair, not dissimilarly to a pose like downward dog, where the body mechanics are a little bit similar in at least the relation between the torso and the legs. The body mechanics are similar in chair and downward facing dog. And so you are lengthening, if very, very strongly, through the upper body, through the torso, in a pose like chair pose. Whereas in a pose like downward facing dog, there's the supportive aspect and then the receptive aspect, right? So in downward facing dog, it's the opposite in that way. You're doing more lengthening through the legs and more strength building through the torso, just by the sheer kind of, again, way that our bodies naturally receive and support. They're not set up to be weight bearing on our hands in that type of an inversion, which makes it, a very important pose. So to that end, when you're talking about chair, it is traditional to the way that our bodies are meant to move and flow. So it's a very, very strengthening pose for the legs and a lengthening pose for the torso. And it's one of those poses where you can hold and you can breathe and you can deepen and you can kind of come out of it. And when you do, it feels like you just freed yourself, right? So it builds the strength for the motion. It sets up the neutral muscle awareness, the repetitive motion training in the body to support other poses from that neutral place. So mountain pose, Tadasana, which is, I know it's improper and people can yell at me for it, but I always like to go Tadasana, which is like my thing because I think it's cute. Obviously wildly inappropriate when it comes to the traditional pronunciation of the word, but it is something that I have said and done for many, many years. And it's just me having a little fun with it. So please forgive me for my whimsy in that way. When we are talking about a pose like goddess, not dissimilar to chair in the way that it is through the legs, right? So we are bending. Goddess pose is hips open. So if we're talking about the hips, the difference between these two postures really, really flows into the hip angle, front and side. So in chair pose, there's an angle that you're creating. So there's a bit of a release, if you will, of the hip flexors because you have that hinge coming between the torso and the upper thighs. When you're talking about goddess pose, you have external rotation through both hips, whereas in chair, you have internal rotation through both hips. And what that means is that in chair, there's a lot less risk of kind of dumping into the lower back and compressing the lower back because of the way that you're setting it up. Similar to downward facing dog, it is a release posture for the lower back. Goddess, on the other hand, is probably one of the more, I don't like to use the word aggressive when it comes to goddess pose because it's such a wonderful restorative pose, even though it's a strengthening pose. But essentially, goddess puts the hips, both hips, in external rotation. We've had the conversation when we talked about warriors about the practicality, if you will, of having one hip in internal and one hip in external, and how it kind of creates a little bit of a stasis, a little bit of a balance, a little bit of a give and take through the pelvic bowl versus a pose like, let's say, bound angle if you're seated, right? Or if you're standing, goddess pose, where you now have both hips externally rotated fully, like think sumo squat for those of you who are not as yoga familiar. So your toes are pointed out at a 45 degree, your heels and toes are in alignment with each other. So it's still got that balance aspect of weeble wobble, but they don't fall down front to back. And it's a long lateral pose. So your knees are stacked over your ankles, your quads are on fire, your glutes are on fire. So whereas in chair pose, it's really more of a quad dominant strengthening. In goddess pose, you're not removing the quads, but it's more of a glute dominant strength. And so because of that, there is a big potential risk for you to start to compress into the lower back if you're not engaging your core properly. And while you have that length created through the torso, much like downward facing dog in a chair posture, in a goddess posture, that lengthening can be completely counteracted by the fact that you have the hips externally rotated and you're kind of crunching that pelvic bowl and compressing the tailbone, which is essentially what happens. Again, based on the body mechanics, as I always say, everybody is different. Everybody has their own body skeletal makeup and structure. It can be symmetrical, it can be symmetrical, it can be asymmetrical. Very, very few of us are 100% symmetrical, especially as we gracefully age. So just these things to keep in mind when you are having a practice that stems to create symmetry, stasis, neutrality, and a happy medium, if you will, in the body. So when we're talking about goddess, while we are getting some length through the torso, it's more of a strength building than a length building. Because again, you're drawing in your core, you're squeezing the thighs towards each other and engaging the glutes, even though your thighs are nowhere near each other, you're still getting that kind of, instead of internal rotation, that external rotation and that engagement, you're lifting up through the arches of the feet in the very same way. And then in addition to all of that, you draw in through the lower abdominals and you engage through the upper back, either pressing out. I always use the cue, think of Luke Skywalker in the trash compactor. And I want to say it was Return of the Jedi, but forgive me for those of you who know Star Wars better than I do. Or traditionally, you can take the index finger to the thumb in your yoga mudra, release those shoulders down, extend with a gentle bend at the elbows. This is a little bit of a more feminine or receptive way to experience the upper body aspect of the pose. If you want strength, press out, think Luke. So again, we're talking about creating strength through these muscle groups in the legs and creating that base, that stasis, that support structure, so that when you go into more movement style poses in, let's say, a vinyasa flow or let's say a balance sequence, that you have this motion, this strength building aspect already primed in the body in the areas that need or require it most. So that's kind of the difference between the internal and external rotation between chair and goddess. And then talking about something like high lunge. So taking what we just talked about and now moving it into more of a body in motion kind of a pose. So high lunge is, I'm going to say a love or hate relationship. So high lunge is kind of like Warrior One on steroids. And the reason for that is one, if you have any foot issues, I would say that high lunge is contraindicated for you. Why? Because the goal of a high lunge is to have the heel stacked over the ball of the foot. Think like stiletto for the ladies out there or the gentlemen out there that prefer to wear them. It is a very aggressive pose on the feet. So now, that being said, you should not have all of your weight on the feet. So why is high lunge the gateway pose, if you will, from this static holding strength building pose into the body in motion? Because you're literally starting to take the framework that you've built in poses like chair and, spoiler alert, oftentimes in a vinyasa class or a flow class of any sort. Chair and high lunge are a hand in hand posture. You'll move from one into the other and back. And why is that? Because chair is the stasis setup pose for a pose like high lunge. You're creating the balance, you're creating the structure through the hips and through the legs. And then as when I teach it, the way I lead through it is that you're shifting the weight, but keeping the balance centered and neutral and letting the leg that steps back into chair have very, very little weight on it at all. So that in some way it is a warrior three, which is standing on one leg and having the other leg extended back so that you're on one foot, or even a dancer, even standing leg split. That transition from chair into high lunge is the same transition you're going to have into a dancer, into a hips facing forward or hips neutral balance asana, balance pose. So when we talk about our high lunge, the front leg is not dissimilar to chair. It's not dissimilar to warrior one. You have a bent knee. Ideally, in a high lunge position or in a warrior one position, it's going to go from chair. It may not be a 90 degree. The goal is eventually to have a 90 degree, but if you, for whatever reason, are not there yet, then the main important aspect in cue is to just keep the knee behind the toes, right? Don't let the knee go so far, ideally behind the ankle, but never let it go in front of the toes. That puts too much pressure on the kneecap, on the joint. And if you're not actively engaging the leg enough, you can, do damage, which we never want to have happen. So when you're moving into a high lunge, you're then shifting the weight off of one foot onto one in a chair position 9 times out of 10. And then you're starting to bring balance and motion into that by stepping the foot back. Now, can you also come from a low lunge into a high lunge? 100%. Can you come from downward dog into high lunge? 100%. Are there a multitude of ways to come into a high lunge? Of course there are. But a way that keeps you in the body mechanics of chair pose and into high lunge, it's a very, very seamless, very gentle, and very well-primed way to make that transition. So in your high lunge, when you step your foot back again, as mentioned, the heel stacks directly over the ball of the foot, which, you're putting a lot of pressure on there. So you don't want a lot of weight. So you don't want to be putting all of your body weight on that back leg. You want the body weight to be balanced over the front leg, over the energetic line from the pelvis down through the heel, right? In theory, with the knee facing out a little bit forward. And then from there, you want to have that equal and opposite reaction between the front and back leg. And the fun thing about high lunge is not dissimilar to like a downward dog, which we also talked about in relation to chair. High lunge also keeps both hips internally rotated, allowing a lot of room in the pelvic bowl for that tailbone to be able to lengthen. So you are, as opposed, it's kind of the opposite of goddess in that it's similar to chair in that way, where you're still creating a lengthening through the lower back. But now in this case, what's positive about that is because the one leg is now back behind you, you're actually deepening. It's a very, very intense stretch for the psoas, which is probably the biggest distinction and other hip flexors. But we like to harp on the psoas because the psoas attaches the spine to the leg. So when you're talking about that, it is arguably one of the deepest hip flexor stretches. Maybe not the deepest, because you can get a little bit deeper in your low lunge than you can in your high lunge, but that's because you have a safer base on your knee. You're you're on the ground as opposed to incorporating that aspect of balance into it, which high lunge is definitely a pose that focuses on balance and motion from not only the entry and the exit, but also from just holding it statically. But what's great about it is high lunge is your balance primer for any single leg standing balance postures. It is that are forward facing, not lateral facing. For example, think Warrior 3, not Half Moon. So high lunge is where you want to get to. That's your goal pose for creating the balance in the pelvis and in the core and through the legs to be able to do some of those more demanding balance asanas and postures. And it creates a lot of strength in through the legs. Now, what we just touched on, what high lunge does is it starts to also incorporate what we talked about at the beginning, which is the give and take, the release of one to the engagement of the other, because you are very much engaging through that, through the glute, although it's a little bit different because it's not externally rotating the way that it is in Goddess. So you are engaging the glute, but it's more actually through the hamstring and through the calf and heel. It's the line of energy that comes through that leg by the pressing out through that extended heel that supports the balance and the flow of energy. Whereas that, again, internal rotation aligns that hip flexor to really deepen, target, and strengthen, or I should say lengthen, forgive me, not strengthen, lengthen through that hip flexor of the extended back leg. And then obviously, anytime you do one side, you want to keep it even and flip to the other side as well. With all of that being said, there are also, and I practice this every time I do a workout, I make sure to do a leg release mini yoga sequence after I do my workout. And I may share that little mini because I do the same thing almost every time. And what does it do? It's all seated. There's no balance involved. It's all seated, and it focuses on the hips, the quads, and the hamstrings. Obviously, it incorporates twisting, some back movements and some arm movements as well. But the idea there is a pure release because in theory, you've just done a very aggressive, well, maybe not very aggressive for me, but like a typical workout, not a yoga practice. So this is my yoga practice that I incorporate post-workout to release all of that effort that I just built up. And so when we talk about movement through our legs, strengthening through our legs, we just went into some postures that will really help to build strength and build stasis for strength and start to build that idea of forward motion from a grounded, supported, strengthened place. What comes after that is once you are in motion and you need to come back to rest, the legs also play a very, very big role. And as much as you need to strengthen them, they can also be, for many people, one of the most challenging, tight areas of the body. And so when I do, I'll give some teasers. I'm not going to give the entire flow sequence, but some of the things that I do are to focus on the hip flexor release, the quad release. The hamstrings get probably the biggest focus of all, and even the tops of the feet. So I will, let's say, do many forward folds, variations of sage and sage twist. So I draw those knees in, I give them a nice big squeeze. Then there's a lot of hip rotation. So I'll come into a variation of sage twist where I'm deepening into the outer hip. I'll come into a half lotus posture so that I'm really opening up through the hip flexor. I'm extending and releasing through the external rotators through the back of the hip and through the glute. And then I'll come into some variation, if you will, of a pose that is not necessarily a true yoga pose, but I'll come into a variation of crane, which we talked about in the Birds of a Feather episode. So I invite you to go back and listen to that. And I'll even come into some variations of not necessarily low lunge, but there are ways that I found to target the hip flexors. I'll come into variations of hero, variations of our forward folds, our Janu Sirsasana, our revolved head to knee is a big one. Wide leg forward fold, I do every time. Bound angle, I do every time. So these are just, and I'm flying through them for a reason, mainly because that is going to be another another day. So I don't want to deep dive too much in, but I just want to focus on the importance of the balance through the legs. Not only do you need to strengthen them, because if the legs are weak, and I will say throughout my life, my legs have probably been one of the weaker aspects of my body, unfortunately. It's not that they are themselves weak, it's that there have been injuries, issues. When I had Lyme disease as a child, it always flared up in my right knee. So I've always had knee issues, hip issues, inability to run issues, things like that. So they've been more of I'll say an area of the body that needs tender loving care and forgiveness versus an area of the body such as my upper body, which has been a little slightly less problematic for me over time. And again, like I said, I don't like to want to focus on the problem, so we'll say in a little more need of some TLC, and that is definitely the legs for me. So for others, they may have very, very strong legs and really need to focus on that release and lengthening. So as I mentioned, your forward folds. I did a whole episode on forward folds, different variations of forward folds. Everybody loves a forward fold. They're gentle, they're calming, they're restorative. The benefits are honestly endless when it comes to forward folds. So they're always just wonderful, and especially for those with tight hamstrings. But as I mentioned, you need to make sure that you're doing them correctly and not sitting so far back. What happens 9 times out of 10 is that people have very, very tight hamstrings. They can't get their sits bones behind them far enough so that when they forward fold, they're bending through the lower back and their hamstrings aren't even feeling anything. That's what happens when we have people with very tight hamstrings who don't have the prop of, let's say, a slight wedge or even a folded blanket to get their hips a little more elevated. And then it's like a light bulb moment when a person actually feels the way a forward fold is supposed to feel. So it's a lot easier to teach standing up in an upright forward fold. The problem is the same issue rears its head in a standing forward fold. You can actually do damage to the back if you're dumping into the lower back as opposed to actually accentuating through the back of the hamstrings appropriately. But as mentioned, the most important thing when it comes to the legs is that they deserve as much of a release as they do the strengthening. And so if you know that for you, you have very strong legs, you're a runner, you're a cyclist, you're a tennis player, whatever it is that you do, you're a horseback rider, and your legs are super strong and super tight, then it's going to be a focus on the release, not so much a focus on the strengthening. It's going to be a focus on the balancing and the motion and the relation of the legs to each other, not so much a focus on what we talked about with chair and with goddess pose. So when we're talking about the release, please do go back, listen to the forward fold episode, which was like one of the earlier episodes of my podcast overall, but also think about getting onto your mat as I am right now. Think about grounding, seated, even I have an entire sequence that is all focused on legs where we don't even get up off the mat that I've done in the past with clients and in classes, and they just love it. If you are ever having a day where, as I've said before, you just need to lay down harder, that is the class for you. And I encourage you, if you don't have a strap, get a strap. And it is a full leg release. I'll even call it almost a workshop, essentially. And you just have to be very, very gentle with yourself and treat your legs the way you treat your body, right? Instead of beating them up and abusing them, start to love them for their perfections and their imperfections. Give them that extra loving care. Make sure that you take care of them and know your body, right? Learn your body, learn what you need, learn what's loose, what's tight, what needs love, what needs support, what needs strength, what needs release. And that's what a yoga practice can help you to bring forth if you don't have that awareness within yourself, if you haven't cultivated that conversation with your body. Listening to your body is one of the most, if not the most important thing for your life. And yoga is a wonderful way for those who have not started to cultivate that practice to start to. And remember that it is our legs that carry us forward quite literally through life. And so having strong legs, as I believe I touched on earlier, in Eastern medicine, the idea is that the legs carry the strength of our life. They carry our life force energy. So the stronger our legs, the longer our lives. And that's the theory, right? That's kind of anecdotal and evidence that I'm certainly butchering. But that's kind of the idea behind it. So having the strength in the legs, and if you have the strength, making sure that you also have the suppleness in the legs to carry you forth from grounding, from structure, from strength, from support, and from, if you have all that, then the recognition of when it is that you need to release and relax and come back to your mat. And for example, after a hard workout, then just be on your mat, give your legs some love, and make sure that you listen to your body and give it what it needs. And so, as always, I want to thank you so much for giving your time to me, sharing this space with me. I just want to let you know how much I appreciate each and every one of you, and ask that you please feel free to share this same space with your loved ones. For more goodness, follow me on all the socials at Above the Ground Podcast or visit my website, airsaboveyoga.com. As always, don't forget to check out my other episodes and all of my amazing sisters at the Divas That Care Network. You can find us on Spotify, Odyssey, Apple, Amazon, iHeartRadio, or anywhere else that you might feel guided. Again, my name is Gia-Raquel Rose, owner of Airs Above Yoga, and you are listening to Above the Ground Podcast, where every day is a good one.